Ecuador grants asylum to Wikileaks founder Julian Assange and says that the UK must grant him safe passage out of the country in accordance with international convention. What's behind the decision, and will Assange be allowed to leave? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. It's been nearly 2 months since Julian Assange entered Ecuador's embassy in London in an attempt to avoid extradition to Sweden. And on Thursday, Ecuador's foreign minister announced the country was granting him asylum.
El gobierno del Ecuador, fiel a su tradición.
The Ecuadorian government, loyal to its tradition to protect those who seek protection in its territory or in its diplomatic buildings, has decided to grant diplomatic asylum.
Assange is wanted in Sweden for questioning on allegations of sexual assault. But he says he fears Sweden would extradite him to the United States, where authorities are keen to prosecute him on charges related to the publication of hundreds of thousands of classified US diplomatic cables on his website, Wikileaks. His supporters doubt he will be treated fairly and fear he could even face the death penalty. Assange has repeatedly offered to be questioned by Swedish authorities in London. That option has been declined. And speaking to the Reuters news agency, the lawyer representing the 2 Swedish women who made the sexual assault allegations against Assange called Ecuador's move a, quote, abuse of the asylum instrument. Earlier, I spoke with journalist Irene Casey. She broke the story on Monday that Ecuador had decided to give Assange asylum. I asked her when Ecuador had made that decision.
According to my sources who are part of the Ecuadorian government in Quito and have been close to the negotiations all along, the decision was made before Julian Assange decided to officially ask for the asylum on June the 19th. Actually, my sources say that the reason why he went to the embassy to begin with was because some sort of agreement was already made.
And actually, a state-run newspaper seemed to back up your reporting on Monday as well, which seems odd given the government's position. What is going on, do you think?
Well, the thing is, actually, everyone in Ecuador seemed to believe that a decision had already been made. One congresswoman was very outspoken about it 2 weeks ago. She said that the paper that reported her quote was mistaken, but she did say openly that the president had already decided to give Assange asylum. What I think that is happening is that Ecuador has a real interest in seeing this case as a humanitarian case and in granting Assange asylum because they believe it fits within their policy of giving refugees asylum, and they see Assange as someone who's being persecuted politically. So I think this fits within their policy, but they decided to hold on to the decision so that they could actually go through some of the legal technicalities to get Assange to Ecuador.
You say it fits in with some sort of Ecuadorian strategy, but surely there are huge potential downsides for Ecuador with both the US and the EU for that matter.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, especially when it comes to trade policies. Right now, there is a trade agreement between the U.S. and Ecuador that involves lowering or some lifting of taxes for certain Ecuadorian products in the States. That agreement is up for review right now, so the U.S. Congress might decide to not to renew that agreement. Also, Ecuador is negotiating a new sort of trade agreement with the European Union. So there might be repercussions in that sense. So there have been some businessmen that have been very vocal about how worried they are of the possible repercussions of Ecuador's decision in terms of business in the country.
A lot of people, especially here in the US, have been very quick to point out Rafael Correa's own relationship with Ecuadorian media. You're a journalist based in Quito. What's been your experience?
Well, I mean, many people have seen this as ironic that Correa is standing up for freedom of expression and defending Assange. What what's for sure is that Assange has been very close to Correa. They had an interview on Russia Today in April, and at that point Correa was joking with Assange about how they're both persecuted politically, because this is how Correa sees private media in Ecuador. He believes that they are personally attacking him. And we must remember that in Latin America, and especially in Ecuador, there is a history of sort of political journalism, which is very different from the so-called impartial journalism that there is in the United States or in the UK, for example. So media are often political actors, and this has affected politicians. So in a sense, Correa, there is some grounding for some of Correa's statements, but then he's taken some very strong actions against journalists. Filing libel suits is one against several journalists, even investigative journalists that were trying to uncover some possible involvement of Correa and people in his government in a corruption scandal. So definitely this is something that is affecting journalists, local journalists.
So what happens to Assange now? In the studio is Mark Weisbrot. He's co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. And in Tampa, Florida, Charles Rose. He's a specialist in international law and professor at Stetson University College of Law. Mark, before we get into some of the legal implications, what about that suggestion that Ecuador, this was a foregone conclusion, Ecuador was always going to do this? Is that what you were hearing as well?
Yeah, I don't know that I believe that, because Ecuador did have serious negotiations, or at least on their side, they negotiated with the UK and Sweden over these issues. First, they offered to let Assange be questioned in the embassy itself, and the Swedish government refused that without giving any reason. They also asked if they could get guarantees from Sweden or the UK that Assange would not be extradited to the United States, which is, by the way, legally that's a default situation. In other words, it's what's called specialty. If he were to be extradited to Sweden, and then he would, under the law, have 45 days after they're through with him to go wherever he wants. And
that wasn't guaranteed. No guarantee was given that would be respected.
That's right, because the UK could waive that. And they were asked if they would just agree not to waive that, and they wouldn't agree to that either. So I think if they had agreed, it was the United States they were. They weren't about these charges in Sweden, which are kind of dubious anyway and unlikely to lead to anything.
Well,
because there's no charges, right? The allegations.
Very serious allegations.
The questions. Well, it depends, I mean, how you look at that case. But in any case, they weren't particularly worried about that. What they were worried about was the United States.
All right, well, we'll move on for the moment then. Professor Charles Rose, Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy now in London. What is the legal basis of both seeking political asylum in an embassy and being granted refuge in an embassy?
I mean, you should think of this as the national sovereignty of Ecuador located within the four walls of their embassy in the middle of every country where they have an embassy. It's this idea that in order to have domestic relations and proper communication between nations, we must grant you national sovereignty within your embassy when embassies are located in a particular country. So he is literally on virtual Ecuadorian soil right now. And the United Kingdom arguably cannot intrude, although there is some rumbling within the UK that they may invoke a 1987 statute
and we'll get on to that.
Go in and get him.
But does that mean that any person accused of a crime in any country can just walk into an embassy and expect not to face domestic law in that country?
No, it doesn't mean that. It means that if the country that has that embassy believes that your claim of persecution, of refugee status, of a true need to seek asylum is valid, then it's the choice of that country whether or not to extend to you their protection. Because that's what Ecuador is doing. They are saying to Assange, we will protect you against what we view as persecution by another country.
But where are the statutes that explicitly lay that protection out?
You're not going to find them, because what you're talking about are concepts of international law. And international law grows up over time. Now, we have some treaties. You have the Convention on Human Rights, you have the Geneva Convention, you have the Hague Convention, but you'll notice that a lot of that is designed to prevent warfare and to control abuses internationally. What we're dealing with here, at least on the surface, is an allegation of criminal conduct within a sovereign nation. And from the standpoint of the Swedish government, the actions of Ecuador are denying them the right to exercise the sovereignty that both international and domestic law says they have. They have a right to try someone, or to at least investigate someone, for a crime that occurred within their territorial control. And the action of Ecuador is preventing that.
Right, but the point is...
Great Britain's hands are tied.
But the point is, in this case, though, if Julian Assange fears that he will be extradited from Sweden to the US, is he on protected grounds as per the diplomatic conventions that are being used then?
No, I don't think he is. I think if he goes to Sweden, the concern that he may wind up in the United States is a valid concern. That doesn't mean that it's illegal. It may mean that that is the appropriate legal consequence of the series of actions that Mr. Assange has taken. He's forum shopping. It's like a client who is looking for a place where they get the best deal from the judge or protection from the court. And he's found a place where he is, at least for now, safe from additional legal action. I don't believe it will last.
Well, Mark Weisbrot, what do you make of that then, this legal basis? Assange's argument is he will be extradited from Sweden and face, given the US's record on judicial requirements, perhaps a dodgy trial and even death, and certainly an unfair trial, and perhaps, given Bradley Manning's case and what the UN rapporteur said about Bradley Manning, this might, even Article 3 of the United Nations Convention Against Torture might come into this. You can't extradite someone if there's a fear of torture. How do you help us through all this, if you can, from your perspective? Is this about convention? Is it about perceptions? What's going on, do you think?
Yes, I think this case is completely political, and I don't think the case in Sweden has anything to do with the actions of any of these governments, not the United States and not the UK and Sweden. It's quite obvious that Sweden does not really care about justice in the case of the sexual offense allegations, because they have not bothered to investigate this crime. They had, and this was the testimony of the former chief prosecutor, district prosecutor of Stockholm, said this. The most important thing in a case like this is to interview the parties involved. And they've had more than a year and a half to interview Assange, and they've refused to do it. Why? Because they're pursuing other goals, namely to get him to Sweden, for which there's no legitimate reason to get him to Sweden unless they've got something else in mind. And the same is true, to me, last night, really, if there was any doubt in anyone's mind that this case was completely political, just the fact that the UK took this unprecedented step of threatening to invade another country's embassy, which I can't remember in the last 70 years a democratic government doing that. That shows that this isn't about a case, an ordinary criminal case, because Assange isn't even charged with a crime. I mean, what is the emergency here? Is he a terrorist? Is he dangerous? Obviously, this is political.
So this is about fear of political persecution, and they may not actually be specific statutes, but these are diplomatic conventions which are informally, perhaps, observed by different countries, because, frankly, they never know when they're going to need them as well. And yet we have William Hague saying, quote, "The United Kingdom does not recognize the principle of diplomatic asylum." That's quite a statement, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite outrageous too. And the most outrageous thing is the threat to invade the embassy. And you can see they tried to walk back from that. But Ricardo Patino, who you just showed on on the earlier part, the foreign minister of Ecuador, he released that letter. And I'm quite sure that the UK government never imagined that that letter, that written threat that they made, would see the light of day. And, you know, this is another mistake they made, I think, because this was really embarrassing to them, is they consistently, and the United States State Department does this too, they underestimate the fact that most of the world doesn't share their lack of respect for national sovereignty. Because everybody in Latin America, for example, who sees it, knows that this is completely wrong and outrageous.
Professor Rose, when William Hague says the UK does not recognise the principle of diplomatic asylum, doesn't that have implications for Britons abroad?
It doesn't have implication for Britons abroad, because Britons abroad, if they were to engage in criminal conduct in the country where they were located, Great Britain would not extend to them diplomatic.
Well, how do we know? I mean, what if a Briton abroad is placed into an embassy and is facing extradition to a politically interested party who there are doubts about due process? I mean, which is basically what the charge is here.
But you've got to understand here, to say that there is a doubt about due process does not actually create a doubt about due process. There are a couple of things that have legally been said that are just absolutely not correct. The first one is that Mr. Assange will wind up in a secret tribunal. That's not going to happen.
How do you know?
What he's been investigated for within the United States does not fall underneath the Military Commissions Act and terrorism. It's espionage, which is an Article 3 issue which falls underneath the Constitution and the Article 3 courts of the United States.
How does it fall under the Espionage Act? How does it fall under the Espionage Act if he's actually accused simply of publishing leaked cables? He's not accused of spying or actually procuring the cables from the US. He's a publisher, like the New York Times and the Guardian.
I think what you're going to see is the connection between Mr. Assange and the way in which that information was provided. And it may very well be that he's never prosecuted in the United States, even if he were to show up here. But it's interesting.
Professor, do you believe that?
That what Mr. Assange is doing is he is using gaps in international law to protect himself. It's very well lawyered, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's on firm international law footing. He's found a spot where he has room to maneuver. And from an international law perspective, if the countries involved don't agree that that's what the law is, then that's not what the law is from an international law perspective, in the absence of a treaty or an agreement otherwise. And on this issue of diplomatic asylum, it's an unsettled question. Great Britain is well within their rights to say what they're saying. It doesn't mean that they're going to do anything, but they are making certain that inaction does not equate to acquiescence and agreement with the legal principles that are being stated by Ecuador.
But Ecuador is also within its rights to do what it's doing there, right?
Oh, I think Ecuador is well within its rights right now, and Ecuador will also probably face an economic consequence for that. And you've got to realize that the sovereignty of Ecuador ends at the front door and the back door of the embassy. If you put Mr. Assange in a car and try to drive him to the airport, he's going to drive across British soil. And unless the British agree to allow him to proceed to Ecuador unmolested, he's not going anywhere.
So I've heard some people say, well, what if Ecuador appoints him as some, junior consular official? Would he immediately get diplomatic immunity, or does that have to be subject to the approval of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK?
No,
I don't believe that the office in the United Kingdom would recognize that type of appointment, given what has happened today.
Well, there are actually exceptions to that. For instance, if he were, this isn't clear at all. I mean, if he were appointed as ambassador to the United Nations, for example, the UK government doesn't have to approve that.
Right, but actually there are some doubts as to whether United Nations diplomats do automatically get diplomatic immunity, because of course they're different types.
Well, I think what's really going on here, though, it really doesn't have that much to do with legality, because the UK is not even respecting the most basic convention, the Vienna Convention, which says that the embassy is sovereign territory.
Well, let's move on then to the key question of his fear of what might happen to him in the United States, which the professor sort of brought up. Actually, before we do that, I mean, even putting such an option on the table of regarding political asylum in a sovereign, in a sovereign property on someone else's land, that we will storm your embassy. Isn't that setting a pretty frightening precedent, perhaps? I don't know.
It's horrible, and it's amazing. And like I said, it's really unprecedented.
Right.
I can't think of anything
Right.
like that.
Well, let's get to the basis of Julian Assange's case. This is what the State Department spokesman had to say about the U.S.'s interest in the case.
We were in a situation where he was not headed to the United States. He was headed elsewhere. So I'm not going to get into all of the legal ins and outs about what may or may not have been in his future before he chose to take refuge in the Ecuadorian mission. But with regard to the charge that the U.S. was intent on persecuting him, I reject that completely.
They're not even interested, Mark.
Yeah, that's not believable at all. And again, if you look at what the lengths which the UK has gone through to do this, the bad faith on the part of the negotiations of both the UK government and the Swedish government, the Swedish insistence on dragging him to Sweden with no legitimate reason because he's not charged with any crime, all of this smells of politics, and the UK and Sweden don't really have a foreign policy that's independent of the United States anyway.
Professor Rose, Victoria Nuland there used the word persecute. She didn't say prosecute. Is that significant at all, do you think?
Oh, well, he's not being persecuted, but I think he will be prosecuted when it's all said and done. And I think it's going to be a legitimate prosecution. He is attempting to evade jurisdiction, is what he's trying to do.
No, but now we're talking about the U.S.'s charges against him, though. We understand the grand jury has been convened.
I'm not only talking about the U.S.'s charges. Let's be clear here. The U.S. has an interest. Great Britain now has an interest because he violated the terms of his release pending the decision by the British Supreme Court.
Right.
And Sweden has an interest because 2 Swedish citizens have said that this man allegedly sexually assaulted them. Each of those countries has a clear national sovereignty interest in jurisdiction over Mr. Assange for each of those violations.
Absolutely. So let's cross the Atlantic, though. What about this grand jury that we understand has been convened? Of course, these are secret. I mean, surely, there is this intention to prosecute, if not technically to persecute, although I suppose that's the fear of Assange.
I would say that if Mr. Assange appears in the United States, there's probably a 100% likelihood that he will be subject to an investigation, if not indicted. Now, whether or not he winds up convicted is an issue of court. But you've got to step back for a moment. If you say that this is purely a political issue, then you've got to believe that all of the members of the Swedish government and the Swedish legal system, all of the members of the British government and the British legal system, and all of the members of the United States legal system and State Department have gotten together and decided to do this.
Now, that's ridiculous.
I don't think you could get those three institutions together to order lunch,
this is quite
let
typical.
alone set something up like this on this scale.
I think this is quite typical with people who are trying to defend persecution. They always portray the other side as putting forward a conspiracy theory. There's no conspiracy theory necessary here. It's quite obvious. I mean, the Swedish government has no legitimate reason to bring him to Sweden. They can question him in the UK. And they haven't even once given a reason why they can't do that. They recently, a few weeks or a month ago, went to Serbia to question a suspect. So they were willing to send people to the UK as witnesses to this, so to the proceedings there. So this is quite obvious. And again, does anybody really believe that the UK would have embarrassed itself and taken this extreme step just to deliver a foreign citizen to a foreign government where he's not even charged with a crime? No, they did this because this is really important to the United States government and to the UK government because they're going after Assange for political reasons. It has really nothing to do with allegations in Sweden.
Ecuador, why is Correa doing this? What do you make of these charges that he's not a great person as far as the press freedom of that country is concerned?
Well, you see, this is another thing that's really been misrepresented in the press. If you actually go to Ecuador and you read the newspapers there and watch the television, you will see that, first of all, the press is uncensored. It's very oppositional, and Correa has had some run-ins with them. But the idea, as the New York Times reported as though it were a fact, that there's been a crackdown on the media is a fantastic exaggeration. This you would not see if you went to Ecuador. And the people who are saying this are just taking advantage of the fact that most people in the world have no idea what it's really like in Ecuador.
Beyond the case against Assange and Bradley Manning, as far as we know, Mark, or Professor, very quickly, has any case been opened based on what we found out as a result of WikiLeaks, the potential war crimes?
The only case that I'm aware of is the case of the prosecution against the young enlisted soldier who released the materials to WikiLeaks initially. And that was a criminal justice action that occurred through the military courts-martial system.
But nothing actually as far as...
I'm not aware of another case that has been open.
Professor Charles Rose, thank you very much. Mark Weisbrot, thank you very much to you.
Thank you.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Do you join us again on our next edition?